Are we live? Is it Memorex? No, it's actually the YT and the FB, as I like to call them, which is where we're streaming. In case you didn't know by now, this is MitchHampton, and this is one of a series that I like to do monthly. Book lunch, and such as lunchtime, this is 12 p.m. Thank you, Lori. I always am a little bit nervous at the beginning of every stream about picture and sound, image and sound. It was Godard. You know, there's a new film about Godard coming out very soon. Rick Linklater, Nouvelle Vague, New Wave. So that's on my mind. And, you know, Jean-Luc Godard used to talk image, and text. Any event, we're covering a book today, as we usually do. And I really, as always the case, I never quite know how to proceed. I have a bunch of different ideas, and I write my ideas down here. I said, so this is your host's awful, terrible handwriting. But this is the book today, and I want to talk a little bit up front about books in general. So this isn't going to be just a straightforward, close reading of this quite monumental text. German scholar Andreas Reckwitz. I think it's a pronunciation, I think. The Society of Singularities, by which he does not mean the singularity at all. It was a text written in 2017, and it's in the realm of what we call sociology. There are many, many wonderful disciplines in intellectual life. So many, actually. Not just history and psychology. Those are, in our current moment, for some reason, have outsized popularity. But there's also disciplines like sociology, natural science, anthropology, historiography, intellectual history, which is my favorite. And this is a sociologist. It's German, so it's translated from the German. And so when you're reading a text like this, by an author like this, without being always fully aware of it, you are engaging in a long, geographically, nationally specific discussion with folks like Max Weber, one of the towering figures in all of sociology, who happened to have been German. Max Weber. You are also, whether you like to admit it or not, engaging with Karl Marx to some extent. Whatever, notwithstanding what your position is on his ideas. And also folks that nobody reads anymore that are really great. I can recommend them. David Reisman. The Lonely Crowd was his book in the 50s. And David Reisman, who's mentioned in this text, by the way, because he's a classic in sociology, got to mention David Reisman. There are other directed and inner-directed people, evidently, in the 50s, he thought. And, of course, this crude binary, he, of course, preferred the inner-directed person. Thought the outer-directed person, I guess, just conformed and just did what was told to them. And, a lot of sociology, I have to say, in mid-century, not at all now. Talking about the modernist period, we're now in a postmodernist period, which is, more or less 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. I actually think we're in a new era that's maybe postmodernist because of all the changes. I don't know what to call it. I might just label it something very pejorative, and maybe the age of insanity or the age of the internet. I don't know. Enough about that. But the only reason I'm talking about these folks is that when I read a text like this, your host, I've read David Reisman. I've read Talcott Parsons. I've read Max Weber. I've read Nietzsche. I've read C. Wright Mills. In fact, I go even further. I read the biographies of C. Wright Mills, and folks like that. So I'm fairly pretty fair, mid-level read in sociology. So when I come to this book with all of that stuff I just mentioned in my head, heart, and soul and spirit. I may have read it in the 80s, I may have read it in the 90s, I may have read it in the early 2000s, but it's in me. Putting aside what I think about all of it. I mean, again, I did praise David Reisman. I don't know why. I mean, I don't even know. I just think he's a good writer. There's a thing in life of the quality of prose, which is, is always important. Somebody can write well. That can make up for, I guess you could say, a multitude of sins or vices. It doesn't make up for everything. Like I can imagine a person writing really well, being a great prose stylist who is causing harm in the world. I actually not really sure if that's a thing. So what that means is that, this is very unusual for me to say as a pluralist. We pluralists think everything's separate, not integrated. We don't. We think everything, this thing is here, it's not thing, A is not B, right? But it's sort of, I'm surprising myself in saying, maybe there's a one-to-one relationship. So maybe beautiful prose and stylish writing must necessarily coexist with better ideas. I don't know. I could be wrong, so I'm just thinking out loud. I want to dig into his text, but first I want to thank our producer for giving me this wonderful bookmark. These are personalized bookmarks. See that? M. So Laurie Chester, because I'm celebrating a birthday, or I did celebrate a birthday. Was it 2 weeks ago? 1 week ago? I don't know. 2 weeks ago. Time, right? I turned 58, so I'm going to take a drink of coffee. I've been through a lot of things in life. And so I came at this book with great interest because Reckwitz is like Marcel Gauchet, who we've covered once on this podcast with Michel and Michael Berendt, in our French studies of French philosopher Gauchet, Political History of Religion, Disenchantment of the World. Much like Gauchet, Reckwitz is interested in what I would call, and I came up with this idea on the fly, big periodization, not small periodization, like large-scale human periodization. Eras, times, changes, right? So his idea in this book, and again, bear with me here because I'm trying to summarize this. Look at this, look at all my little, my bookmarks and post-its, which always reminds me, of course, of one of my favorite movies, Romeo and Michelle's High School Reunion. Mira Sorvino and Lisa Kudrow and Alan Cummings and that great comedy from the 90s, The Post-its. I use Post-its, and the characters in that comedy, pretend they invented Post-its, and all that. I won't go on and on about that, but what I'm just saying is that in a scholar like Reckwitz is interested in, he's a sociologist, and unlike historians, sociologists look at things from the point of view of social relation itself. Social relation itself, which is not the same as history. I mean, you can have a history of social relations, and there are histories of social relations, but it's sort of like how you live, how we live, how a person lives. What is it like to stare at a screen? I mean, I have to say, For 30 years of my life, I never looked at the screen. Not once. Never. I just hadn't gotten around to it. 30 years, 25, 30 years. That's a long, think about that. For those of you that are, say, 30 now or 40, think about that. That your host is that new to, relatively new to the computer, the screen. That's very different, of course, than someone that actually grows up with this as a toddler or a 2-year-old. Well, these are, I mean, I'm coming up with these examples on the fly. These are examples of changes in lifestyle, changes in era, how we live. And Reckwitz thinks that we live in an era of singularity, by which he means we, as a society, we became in love with what we perceived to be uniqueness and authenticity, standing out from the crowd. Now, there's a paradox, of course, because part of standing up for the crowd, being unique, is finding others that are unique in a similar way. And so one of the things he talks a lot in this wonderful book, again, this is an excellent book, because he's discussing things that are happening to us and that we are experiencing that other, as far as I can say, other folks are not really addressing. When you find like-minded people, you stop being unique and you form an identity, a club. And so it's interesting. So at one and the same time, there's a kind of an empowering and enfranchisement of all kinds of identities and niches. Whatever it may be, from the most innocuous to the most, I hear my phone beeping. I want to make sure, most innocuous to the most consequential. You know, in other words, it's not, oh, I got to get rid of this stuff. See, speaking of computers, I have, Verizon in its wisdom decided to add notifications that I did not want. Gen X, okay. Yeah, I'm a Gen Xer. And I don't want to talk so much about that, though. I think I'll do other future episodes. Well, I've already done the Gen X show with, well, I've done a couple shows on that topic, actually. But I'm gonna get to cut his book. So I'm gonna start exactly in the middle of his text, because German sociologist that he is, he wants to give a sense of what we're doing. And there's actually an art to that kind of prose and that kind of nonfiction writing. This is a style of nonfiction writing. Totally different from other kinds of nonfiction writing. It's not journalism, it's not history, it's not David McCullough or whoever, or Collapse, it's not Jared Diamond, it's not, and again, these are different kinds of, and this is, just to give you a taste, this is, this chapter is called The Curated Life, and so this every man, woman, he, her, trans, they, is their own curator. And he believes, like your host, you can see why I love this book, he believes it starts in the 70s, in the 80s. And of course, that's true. But maybe it's also true that we're in this kind of new era that started, I don't know, 6 years ago, that is just, kind of insanity or chaos era. I don't know. Mixture of good and bad, but all eras are a mixture of the good and bad. I always come back to that point because it's very easy to lose sight of the comprehensive character of a time period. And it's always very tempting to write off an era. You write off an era, which is, after all, the same impulse as wanting to go back and live in an era. It's the same mistake. In the one instance, you've said the era's all bad. Let's get away from that. Let's do everything opposite. It's like opposite day. We're going to put on our clothes opposite. And there's nothing there in this era for me. It all sucks. It oppressed people. It was awful. That actually can't be true, and it's never least of all true in the period of time he's discussing, because he's discussing the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Those are 30 years of such immense artistic and cultural production alone, technological innovation, and that's one of the reasons why Reckwitz does not use the word neoliberal, because he's trying to distance himself from scholars who portray the 80s and 90s only pejoratively. Reckwitz in this book says it's a mixture of good and bad. It's a time of authenticity and expression, but it's also a time of greatest economic inequality and economic precarity and volatility in economics. And it's a time of fascism emerging. And it's a time of many things. And so, not Dickensian, it's not best of times and worst of times exactly, because that's a specific, well, that's getting into the question of whether the president is like any other time. I actually don't think the president is like the Gilded Age at all, and I don't think it's like Rome or any of that. I think it's our own time, and it might have one or two characteristics in common with those times I just mentioned, but there's enough differences. And so I'm a big believer in discontinuity, not continuity. And so that's my bias, and you don't have to share that bias. But I look at his text from a person, your host, that honors discontinuity, that 1980 people just behaved differently than 2016 people. They just did and do. That's just, there's no way around it. I can tell you from experience. They ate different food. There's chapters in here where he talks about food culture. There was a world in which there was no food culture, a world before Wolfgang Puck and shows like The Bear. A world in which food was more like just fuel and was just something you just consumed just to survive. It was just, really. This is before Alice Waters, and I know all the names. I'm not a food, and Anthony Bourdain, There was a time before they existed. But then those folks, like I just mentioned, they emerge. But that emerges as part of what he's talking about, the curated life. So I've talked too much. This German scholar, let's hear his sense of, and we can see whether you think he's on to something. There's a lot of reading I'm going to do here. A lot to read. So I have to drink a coffee. I should say a word also about, he invents a couple of words, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because I wish he hadn't done so. I don't know if it's necessary. So, he calls the postmodern era late modern era. I don't know why. And he talks about late modern subjects. So coming from Foucault, let's backtrack a little bit here. So Michel Foucault, French scholar who I've discussed, I did an episode on him with Mr. Berendt, came up with this idea of the subject, by which he means you, me, everyone we know, to quote Miranda July. Good film, go see it. You, me, and everyone we know are subjects. But for Foucault, subjects are discontinuous. A subject in 1890 is going to be radically different than a subject in 1980. They are going to think love means different things. They are going to eat different food, of course. I'm not saying they have nothing in common. There is a universality to human nature. But on top of that universality, there's just layers and layers of difference and conflicting tastes and ideas and ideals that come and go. And that's what we're focused on here. In any event, he invents his own words and his own terms, which is okay. I said I didn't like it, but it's his right to do so. I don't have to follow it necessarily. But the curated life. So late modern subjects, and especially those in the new middle class. New middle class is his term for folks like, folks meaning everybody, I guess, who's not dirt poor, or what he calls the underclass. Everybody above that. and everybody beneath Peter Thiel. So that's that's most of the population, right? So it's important because that's probably you and me, the grand, that's a fair I guess categorization. I don't know. So the new middle class, especially the middle class, late modern subjects, we are subjects. Remember, Foucault has the word subjectification. Interesting. We're making ourselves into subjects. We are making ourselves into an actor, an actress, a jazz musician, a certain kind of person. It's what we all do. We find ourselves in the position of having to curate their world and their lives. They live curated lives, meaning this new middle class. The curator originated in the world of art and has been a leading figure there since the 1970s. Curators make choices, acquire disparate works of art from various traditions, and arrange them for exhibitions according to a sophisticated and convincing concept. Essentially, curating involves putting things together. Like Stephen Sondheim putting it together. Finishing the hat, right? The Sunday at the Park at George. Mandy Patinkin, anybody remember? Putting it together. Song? Put things together. By now, the practice of curation has spread beyond the art world and become a common element of the late modern lifestyle as a whole. Okay. As is well known, the aesthetic movements in modernity. So this book is aesthetics oriented. He's saying that in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, we in our society here have taken ideas from the arts and aesthetics of how to live life, even if we're not an artist. Even if we're not an artist. We are making ourselves, we're expressing ourselves, and we're expressing ourselves to a degree that was never done or even possible for much of human history. So I want to stay on that a little bit, because is that not a positive thing? Again, I don't, make no mistake, if you were going to ask me, Mitch, is there anything you don't like about the 80s and 90s? Well, yeah, I don't like Reaganism. I don't like economic inequality. I hate it. But that's not all that was going on. Those things were bad, but there were other, again, good things and bad things. But again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying, anyhow. So, so we start, he says, his phrase is that we start to act like artists. In light of the late modern lifestyle, however, it seems more accurate to say that subjects behave less like artists than they do like curators of their own lives. So he's saying that we're not artists, we're like, all of us, each person is acting like we're in charge of MoMA or the Met. Right? And so I arranged I arranged all my books here. All these pictures. So I'm living, for this show, and you're going to tune in here and you're going to see that I like Fred Astaire, and I've got signed photographs of Fred Astaire behind me. I've signed photographs of Jacqueline Bisset, the actress, and Mel Mayron next to each other. Inexplicably, I have a signed Paul Schrader. Good stuff, right? Paul Schrader on Bresson is interviewing all kinds of really rich. And these things reflect my interest. It reflects the fact that I love Bresson, the filmmaker, and I love French cinema. That I love Jacqueline Bisset and Mel Mayron, and that I, these are things that I like. And these are books that I've read. I'm not gonna put books behind me here that I would never have a book that I haven't read and displayed it. I mean, not so much because it's dishonest, but because, well, why not show something you've read, so we could talk about it. It's, so that's interesting, right? So we're curators, right? The traditional notion of aesthetic genius proceeded from the assumption that artists express themselves in their own independently created work. The work itself seemed like a demiurgical act. That's from demiurge, the word. As though the artist had brought it into the world Important Latin word here, overused perhaps, ex nihilo. That means from scratch, out of nothing. Ex nihilo, great Latin word. The late modern subject, on the contrary, this is an important difference. See, we're talking now about how the postmodern is different from the modern. In the modern, the artistic genius just creates Beckett's Waiting for Godot. And, it's unique, and who is lucky and who is happy, and Estragon, who are these strange characters, and the mystery of it, and the wonder of Beckett's text. The uniqueness of Jackson Pollock's painting. In the postmodern period, Angels in America, Tony Kushner, where you have all kinds of things on stage. You have Christian conservatives and Mormons, and you have New York Jews, and you have socialists and conservatives, and you have Roy Cohn, and you bring there's kind of it's the messiness and the busyness of life presented to you, represented to you by Tony Kushner and George C. Wolfe on the stage. Very different than Godot and Beckett, a very different sensibility. But you can see in Angels in America, there's a curatorial. It's almost like Tony Kushner is saying, I'm picking this thing here, I'm picking this thing here, I'm putting it together. Not unlike how Quentin Tarantino makes movies, I have to say. And so we can go on. But you get it, you get the sense of the picture here, of the change, right? So the late modern subject never starts from scratch. Nope. We don't start from scratch. We're always beholden to something. We're beholden, we're influenced by something before us. Influenced by something from the past. We don't want to reject the past. And it's not that we're uncritical. We criticize the past. But the past is part of who we are. We bring it, we got to bring it with us, No escaping it, right? It's not from scratch, but he says is rather situated with an enormous, heterogeneous, global, transhistorical, hypercultural network of already existing and circulating practices and objects. From Beijing to Cuba as a vacation spot, from working as an author to enjoying Art Deco, from veganism to gender codes of mothers and tough women. All of this already exists in our culture. This is the exact situation of curators. For them too, works of art, everyday objects, theories, photographs are already present. They never introduce entirely new objects into the world. Now you could say that even the most modernist, avant-garde artists themselves is not entirely new. They said make it new, but you could say, well, Samuel Beckett, it's unique what you do on the stage, but isn't this little thing you do in the play here? Beckett, for example, Samuel Beckett was obsessed with Dante. I'm just saying, his favorite author was Dante. So could you say, Beckett, is that influenced by the Divine Comedy, this Waiting for Godot? So in that sense, is it really totally new? No. Beckett is honoring in that play, even though the millions of people that have seen Waiting for Godot never think of this, honoring Dante, the spirit of Dante, of all people. So that's something from the past, from another century, that's influencing Beckett. Even though Beckett, of course, is very innovative, very new. I don't want to take away from the fact that what Beckett did on the stage had not been done by, considering what plays were until then. George Bernard Shaw, Ibsen, very different, of course. But yet rooted in something, coming from somewhere, right? So it's the art of the curator. The curator's art. And of course, he doesn't mean the job curator. He means all of us as curators of our life. Lies in the clever way that they select, appropriate, transform, and embed disparate things into a harmonious whole that nevertheless preserves its heterogeneity. I love that. I'm going to read that again. It's a harmonious whole that at one and the same time preserves the heterogeneity. It doesn't sacrifice. So he's saying there isn't this boring sameness that results. Actually, there's diversity within it, what people have done or are doing. I'm just saying. you get a sense here that he likes it, right? Towards the end of the book, it creates, well, all sorts of awful developments. You know, of course, authoritarianism politics, violence, and mass school shootings, and there's all, again, keeping in mind it's not all good, but this is the sort of the positive part of it. The attitude of the curator has left its mark on just about every aspect of the late modern lifestyle. And so I'm going to skip ahead. It's interesting. He says, creativity means reconfiguring the realities at one's disposal in light of a late modern culture, in which, as we have seen, cultural practices and objects exist in excess. So there's this excess of stuff. So you could say the excess of stuff is a negative thing. You could, if you don't like, if you're an ecologist and you think, oh, too much stuff. Or you're a minimalist in temperament, which I am not. Your host is not a minimalist in temperament, but even that too is positive, because this excess of stuff causes us to actually throw things away and select, and you have stuff to work with, if that makes any sense, right? Because there's an excess. You have something to work with, right? You could create something. So, and he goes, in late modernity, that's his term for where we are now. Again, I call it postmodernity, he calls it late modernity. This choice is typically no longer made on the basis of instrumentally rational criteria, but rather, and often primarily, according to cultural criteria. This is important because he's a culturalist. He has the term in this book, we are in a hypercultural age. And all he means by that is that we're not motivated by mere material goods and money. By cultural, he means things like meaning, values, expression, ideas, ideals. Those things can be thought of as culture. And he's saying those things I just mentioned are more powerful, right? They've come to the fore. They've come to the fore. So, culture, that's cultural criteria. And so he has a funny list here. Zen Buddhism or German Protestantism? Question mark. Pasta or sushi? Question mark. Opera or hip hop? Question mark. Preparatory school or Montessori school? iPhone or Galaxy? Friedrichshain or Kreuzberg? That's a German reference. I don't know what it is. You German folks will have to tell me what that's a reference to. I don't know. The cultural objects and practices of late modern consumption do not seem prescribed or compulsorily normative. So normative, remember from our previous episodes, is the term in philosophy of ethics for right and wrong. It does not mean sort of what's common statistically or what the norm. It doesn't mean what we think of it as the norm. It means actually, normative means, you know, the right thing to do, full stop. So, but he's saying here that it's not compulsorily normative. Instead, okay, what is it? If it's not normative, what's it based on? Instead, they are possibilities. Possibilities that in principle exist on equal footing and are equally available. So again, it's open possibility. It's interesting. So I found and this is under a chapter called The Singularistic Life. Moreover, the new middle class treats all of world culture, including its own culture, by the way. It's not, I don't want to get away from, you know, pejorative implications of people stealing cultures. No. Everything, our own culture, our own roots, other people's roots, everything becomes a resource for self-actualization. So it's back to those things I mentioned earlier. It's back to meaning and value. Meaning and value. from this perspective, culture is not something that is reproduced within one's own social group, as was traditionally the case. So that's another change too, is that people are not only stuck in their own culture. They can move from culture to culture. And it's not coincidental that a common phrase that some of the kids use and some sociologists use is something they call code switching. Right? Your host, I don't switch codes. I always talk in the same damn formal. I'm going to talk in this damn formal manner now as I would if we met for coffee, and and friends of mine can tell you, my girlfriend can tell you, I pretty much always speak the same way. But that's but I get it. Some people want to shift language or shift. And his term for that is it's a hyperculture, and all he means about that is that things have become. Things have become highly cultural or magnified. In the cultural dimensions, magnified. It's the most important. Everything's become culture. Within hyperculture, everything can become a culture. So there could be a culture of dog moms. Laurie, is there a culture of dog moms? Is that a real thing? Yes, it is, right? Are you a part of that? There could be a culture of jazz piano players. People that wear suits. I don't know. But what I mean is that there's a lot of potential here. People. This is interesting, saying that all empirical studies are important. All empiricism is you observe what is. So an empirical study would say how many people tuned in to the last season of MASH. I mean the last episode of MASH or the last episode of Seinfeld or Game of Thrones. And that's an empirical, you do the data and you say, well, I'm really heartfelt about the numbers of political judgment because they're on the side of the good. In other words, I like the approval ratings at one. I like the developments because that's but those are empirical questions. You go out and say, well, how many trees are there in this forest? How many people watch this TV show? How many people, I don't know, how many people live in a town? Is a town populated by 5 million people or 5,000 people? It could be a very different town if you just have 5,000. Or Joanne, my girlfriend, grew up in a town with what? 150 people or something? I don't know. I keep forgetting because that's so small. Amazing. Can you imagine that? Your life's going to be very different if you just have 100 people around you than if you have 5 million people around. It's going to feel different. You're going to develop different, what's the word? Coping patterns and preferences. And when I first moved to Weaverville, North Carolina, I was very specifically taken aside and said, you must wave to people here. That's what's polite. And I thought, why do I have to wave to? I'm from a big city. If you waved to everybody that went by, you'd be doing this constantly. Because you're surrounded by thousands, you can't pay attention. But I realized that cultural pattern of waving is because there's nobody here. In other words, in the space of an hour, just one person or two people will go by. And so, that's a purely contingent. That's not right or wrong. That doesn't mean that the way of life here is better than in Boston. It's just what's suitable or right for a small town or for, and this is the interesting thing about all this. So I didn't read a lot from this book. I just read those 2 pages, and there's elements, and he mentions food. He mentions food culture. Another thing he mentions is the mania of parents, helicopter parenting, wanting to have the right zip code and the right school district, and how there's a competition over that, which is ruthless, brutal and ruthless. So one of the negative things isn't just economic inequality, but it's also a ruthless competition over everything is a hallmark of this era we're in now. There's more, he argues, there's more competition than before. It's one of the things he says. And I think he might be right. Travel. Yeah. His term for this is differential liberalism. So he doesn't use the term neoliberalism, he uses differential liberalism. All he means by that, I think, is I guess a liberalism where people compare and contrast things. You know, I don't like that church over here, they're too conservative. I'm going to join this church because I'm a woman and I had an abortion 2 years ago, and I don't want to be shamed for having had an abortion in this church here, so I picked this church. I don't know. I'm picking examples out of, yeah, Dick Hensley and the Dog Mom. Yes, that's right. Those are yeah. So that's different. It's differential, and then it's a transformation. Now, of course, you know, this era that I've just described for you creates all of these very, very bad results, not just good results. So it doesn't just increase expression and increase pleasure, does both those, and choice and freedom. It also increases backlash against it. Backlashes against these very things. People that want to go back to the 50s or the 1870s or 1880s or their image of those times. And religious fundamentalism. And there's long sections here where he discusses religious fundamentalism. Cultural nationalism. You know, the Quebecois movement in Canada, you know, the French separatist movement in Canada, just one example. LGBTQ+, so all of these things, and then like I said, he discusses school shooting, mass violence. So he sees these things, I guess, as side effects, negative side effects of this impulse to express or impulse to find like-minded people and form associations, which, put it that way, sounds very anodyne, right, and sort of innocuous, right? I'm just forming associations, you know. We haven't said what the association is for, or what is, you know. I really enjoyed reading this book. I really enjoyed his, he gets into how we live now. He gets into how we live now. You know, the rise of the particular. Of course, all societies need generalities. We need infrastructure. We need vaccinations and antibiotics and to treat disease, and we need to have hygiene and go out in public and wash our hands, and all. What I'm saying is that those are things involving what we hold in common. And so all of this stuff is very good and well. The expression, the creativity, of course I love it. But there's the practical dimension to life. Infrastructure, people's salaries, cost of living. And these are the things, see, that's just I think I'm tempted to leave it, end on those phrases, because of course that's part of life too. And maybe there's a sense in which civility, interesting. Well, that's, yeah, well, There's actually essays being written now against civility. I've read a couple of them. So even that's, not everybody agrees on civility, but I happen to like civility, but what can I tell you? But these are all contested things. But I'm just saying that there's things we actually hold in common. We breathe the same air, and we breathe the same oxygen. I mean, these two events of the pandemic, COVID, and this horrible storm that I and many of us experienced last year, really brought home a sense of you live in a place, your immediate environment. I mentioned waving to people when you say hi to them. I mean, that's something I do out of deference. I mean, I haven't fully, I do it, but it still feels like a suit of clothes that doesn't fit because, you know, I didn't do that for 30 years living in the city, but I would wave to somebody if I knew them, you know. But that's different. Waving to everybody, you know. These are. My only hope, you know, after reading this book and looking at some of these books, I never got to talk about books themselves because I wanted to talk about publishing and book covers and different kinds of book covers, and you know, I should do one day just an episode just on the aesthetics of book design. How about that? Maybe I'll do that. Our next book launch is going to be on Thomas Pynchon with Joe, girlfriend Joe, and we're going to do that, but there's more to come. And I think I'm going to conclude on that note because I feel like I've given you the sense of Reckwitz's panoramic, comprehensive view of how we live now, where we are now, which rings true to me. And I hope everybody has a really good weekend or decent weekend. And I will see you again soon. I'm doing a solo performance on the 20th here. And some other surprises coming up. So thank you. And this is Journey of an Aesthete podcast. And have a great weekend.